I'm Josette Lewis, Director of the Office of Agriculture at AID. If you could talk a little bit about the relationship between GDP growth and job creation, both in middle and low-income countries. Are they directly related or not directly related in both those categories? Pardon?
Speak up, please.
Oh, okay, sorry. The relationship between GDP growth in agriculture and GDP growth generally and job creation. And is that are they related in both middle income and low income countries or not?
Would you like to take them one by one, probably?
Because I'll forget them if I never answer the first one. Let me make a series of comments. First of all, it's very unhelpful when the World Bank says that economic growth reduces poverty, okay? Because it's the structure of that growth that matters, and that's what annoys me so much about Martin Revallian is why isn't he blasting away on what his research is showing? His research shows that the structure matters. Now that's not a popular view in the World Bank or anywhere because it's okay to say the market will get you growth. It's a little more difficult to say the market will get you the right structure of growth. It's possible to say that, but particularly if agriculture is part, you have difficulty. So it's the structure that matters. Now, let me just give you two numbers. That in middle-income countries, if they get a fast growth rate in all sectors, so that the manufacturing sector with its multipliers, it has multipliers also, is growing at 8 to 10%. The agricultural sector is growing at 5%. In that kind of a growth rate, which is a pretty fast overall growth rate, you'll get about 80% of your incremental employment driven by agriculture and its multipliers. Now, employment generation let me put it more technically, the elasticity of employment with respect to output growth in agriculture is quite low, around 0.3. If you have any kind of technological change driving it. If it's horticulture and so on, it'll be a little higher. But around 0.3, that's not much better than manufacturing. Now, manufacturing recently in Indonesia, the last 4 or 5 years, has been zero. Okay, they've had pretty good growth in their manufacturing sector, essentially no growth in employment. So it's the multipliers from agriculture. So in a middle-income country, you're going to get, with this high growth rate, you're going to get about 80% of your employment growth from agriculture and its multipliers. You're going to get less than a third of your GDP growth from agriculture and its multipliers. And the multipliers are quite large because the demand for the rural non-farm sector is pretty elastic. It's hard to get this because the consumer expenditure surveys aren't broken down right, but the elasticity of demand for the rural non-farm sector by farmers is probably up in the 1.25 to 1.5 range. This means that the rural non-farm sector grows a lot faster than the farm sector in that sense. But even with that, you're getting less than a third of your GDP growth from these sectors. Now, when you move to the low-income countries, you're going to get somewhat more than 80% of your employment growth out of agriculture and its multipliers, and I keep repeating, and its multipliers, and you're going to get about 40% of your 45% of your GDP growth out of agriculture and its multipliers. And the urban sector has multipliers, but they're much weaker because, let me just back up on this. These multipliers are from farmers who are small farmers spending locally. If most of the land is held by absentee landlords, those multipliers aren't there. That, first of all, by definition, if they're absentee, they're not spending locally. And we know that with rich hacienda owners in Chile and so on, they have a very large import content in their consumption and a very high capital intensity content. So those multipliers are much less. And secondly, in the urban sector, a relatively small proportion of the income in manufacturing is going to laborers. Even in the labor-intensive industries, a fairly high proportion is going to capital. And in Guatemala, the return to capital goes to Korea, right? Because so much of the investment in the manufacturing is foreign private investment. So those multipliers aren't so good. Not to say it's not a good idea to have those industries. There are a lot of reasons why you like GDP to growth. First of all, you might tax it and help with agriculture a little bit along the way. So the point is that the weight, even in middle-income countries, on poverty reduction is still very heavy with agriculture, and that's why countries like India, Indonesia, and so on should be pushing their agriculture. Not that it's going to help their GDP all that much, but it really helps. And remember, the nice Italian queen they have in India, she figured this out and pushed the Congress Party in the previous election to emphasize rural areas. She understood this. I don't know how she got to understand that, but somebody must have talked to her, not me. But they didn't do the job, and it's going to hurt them in this election.
My name is Charlie Kabanga. I'm a student at Brandeis University. My question is about, you have talked about the aid side. You recognize that it has been decreased for the last 20 years. And then what would be the responsibility from the developing countries themselves? Because, for example, they are required to invest at least 10% of their budget in agriculture, but they don't do that. Is it because they don't recognize also the importance of agriculture or not?
You know, IFPRI played a very important role in coming up with that 10% number, and behind that 10% number is a strategy and so on. And I think that's all very good. I think that, let me just back up a little bit on this. If you look at the history of Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, the rural sector was always very important politically, and therefore was able to get a lot of rural infrastructure investment. In Japan, you got, with the Tokugawa, with the Meiji Restoration, the end of the Tokugawa period, you got an emphasis on agricultural science and research stations from 1868 on, and so on. The typical developing country was a colony and got independence under pretty much urban-led independence movements. So that you got governments initially that were very urban-oriented, probably reinforced by a somewhat poor law and order situation, which meant that urban riots could develop and affect the political system. I think that the Kenyan independence movement was an exception to this. That really was heavily a rural-oriented independence movement. And Kenya is one of the countries that in the first 20 years after independence really did very well in agriculture. And I think it's partly for that reason. You had a government that was agriculture-oriented. In some ways, Zimbabwe must have looked a little bit like a rural-oriented independence movement, but something went wrong there somehow along the line, and maybe they weren't that rural-oriented after all, because they certainly didn't do a very good job in the rural sector, even to start with there. My point is that most developing countries have governments which neglect the agriculture and the rural sector, and foreign aid did a tremendously useful thing in Asia in pushing governments to do much more in agriculture than they wanted to do. And that was very, very helpful. And when we drew back from that, the emphasis on agriculture dropped off. Now, in Africa, at the present time, I think this push that gave you the 10% and so on, it looks like there's something behind that. That, after all, was approved by the heads of state, and the whole plan behind it was in theory approved by heads of state. And it looks as though there are several African countries that really are taking an interest in the rural sector from a growth point of view. I think that's true in Ethiopia, isn't it? That the top of the government really is interested in doing something in agriculture.
About 10 countries which approach the 10% goal step by step.
Yeah, okay. And you have to do it step by step. I don't disagree with that. So what's the point? The point is that foreign aid still has a very important role to play in pushing governments to give more emphasis to agriculture than they would otherwise do. Is that arrogant? Yeah, probably. But it's an arrogance that perhaps is looking ahead and saying, hey, eventually you guys are going to have to worry about democracy and the rural sectors and so on. And we happen to know a lot about how to do this. Why don't we sit down and talk about it and see where we can go on it? But you put your finger on some things that are moving in the right direction in Africa. Whether it's strong enough to push the donors into doing what they need to do or not, I'm a little doubtful on. I think the donors are going to have to reform somewhat on their own. Now, one last point on this. I'm completely pessimistic about, and probably it's a good thing, about donors getting together in country and agreeing on coordinated plans. And it's probably a good thing because it's probably agreeing on the wrong coordinated plan. I think that countries have got to come up with strategies for their whole economy and for agriculture and with priorities, and then they've got to coordinate the donors. And I think there's a bit of that happening here and there. I think with IFPRI's help, Ethiopia's doing that, and I think there's some other cases that are doing that.
The number one message of the World Development Report is that the structure of agricultural growth, structure of growth,
yes,
does matter for
yes,
poverty reduction.
Yes, I agree.
You see what Mr. Zolik has picked up when he talked about the World Development Report. That is the one thing he did pick up from the report and has been broadcasting it quite widely.
Okay.
We did not give as much attention to the multipliers as you did, because the multipliers essentially assume that you have a demand-constrained non-farm sector.
Yes.
And that there's no constraints on the supply side. And I think that's probably we're overestimating these multipliers. We did put quite a bit of emphasis on something I'm surprised you haven't mentioned, and that is the impact of increased productivity on food prices, and as being a major vehicle for poverty reduction. I think your own work
yes.
has shown that, and I think particularly in the context of these low-income countries where most of your food is non-traded and in many cases non-tradables, that is probably more important as a vehicle in terms of the indirect effects of agricultural growth on poverty reduction. Having said that, I also would say that I think you're being a bit too pessimistic. I think things are turning around.
Yes.
And maybe USAID has a little way to go. Perhaps after next Tuesday we'll see a change. But as I see from the other donors, from the World Bank, I think we're definitely seeing a very significant increase in interest in agriculture. Thank you.
So can I just make a couple of comments on that? There certainly is substantial turning around going on now. And maybe one of the most noticeable is DFID, which I want to mention this because I think they really have, this is the British foreign aid, I think they really have turned around in London. I don't think it's seeped out to all of their country missions, but hopefully it gradually will. But that's the good news, and the bad news is they got rid of essentially all of their technically competent people. So they have a real problem in moving on this now. But I agree with that, and I just want to be clear that I agree that the WDR is very clear about the impact on employment. But I wanted to lead off on that. It's very hard. Very often I find it convenient to talk in terms of let markets operate. And one place I do this is when people ask me, what are they doing in the rural non-farm sector? And the truthful answer is, I don't really have a very good idea what they're doing in the rural non-farm sector, but the statistics are clear. There are an awful lot of people who would die if they weren't doing something other than agriculture. So they're doing something out there. And then I say, and the market's determining what it is, so we don't care what it is. So let the market farmers decide. But I think the key point, and this shows up very carefully in the piece that Chris Delgado did with various people, colleagues here at IFPRI, that practically all of what's produced in the rural non-farm sector is non-tradables. And so you do need that farmer market for them. There's some exceptions here and there, but handicrafts hardly anywhere amount to a significant portion of it, the exportable handicrafts. So it is a non-tradable sector. And I think the problem that people have in understanding the importance of it is that it's a high proportion services. And that's where you have trouble telling people. You know, a peasant farmer who's, you know, has an income 3 times the average for the village, which is a lot below my income on anybody in this room. What happens when that farm family's income goes up? They tend to hire a servant, and they have someone who comes in and helps in the household and so on. And most foreign aid people living in the city say, oh, poor people don't have servants. Well, what's the cheapest thing you can buy in a village? What's cheaper than Chinese goods? It's the services that are really cheap. And as long as there's some underemployed labor, that wage rate isn't going to go up very much. So that, I mean, we hope that we'll tighten up the labor supply and the wage rate will start going up, but it doesn't for a while. And so services are very, very cheap. And so farm families buy services. You know, the first service you buy is to hire somebody to work in the fields so your wife isn't working in the fields in that situation. And that's a very important increase in employment. And but the household thing. So I think it's very important to drive at this point that most of these goods and services are non-tradables, and therefore it's there. Now, the last point I'm always embarrassed about when people bring up this price issue, because as a lot of you know, I guess the bulk of my early academic reputation was built on the writing stuff in that area. The big argument against what I used to say on the price thing is, John, you're just talking about closed economies. You worked in India, and when they increase food production in India, it's not tradable on international markets, so the price comes down. But we have a new world now. There are international markets out there. When are you going to discover that? Well, I discovered to the point of never even mentioning the price factors, okay? So that the price effect isn't going to be very much if you really have open trade in commodities. Now, very important point that particularly in Africa, a lot of the food commodities, basic staples, are really non-tradables. It's the same reason a lot of the other stuff is. It costs too much to ship it out, and it's a different quality, and so on. And so that really belongs in the rural non-farm sector, but you can increase productivity there.
My name is Louis Emery. I've been in the developments business for
longer than me.
Not 55 years, but about 35. You have partly answered the question I was going to put. Assume development assistance shifts to agriculture, as you mentioned, 25%, 30%. But all the other international and national economic relations remain the same. The agricultural subsidies in the industrial world remain the same. The Doha round remains a disaster and remains the same. Whilst then the developing countries, the poor countries, are doing well in agriculture, they may even have a surplus. What are they doing with it? They can't export them to the rest of the world. The subsidies. So what must change at the international level, other than the shift in development assistance to 20, 25, 30%? In other words, what I say is you have concentrated on one aspect of international economic relations. Development is not on the other aspect, international relations.
Let me make the point worse than you did, even worse.
But briefly, because
okay. That you really want agriculture to grow faster than domestic demand. So you do want to increase net exports of agricultural commodities. So you are on the international market. Now, I think the saving grace is a lot of this can be tropical commodities which compete somewhat. I mean, for example, oil palm it is the cheapest source of vegetable oils, but it does compete at the margin with soybeans and so on. Cotton is, of course, the worst case, and in West Africa, one should be producing a lot more cotton, and it's going to run exactly into the problem you indicated. I think what I would do on the trade front is to try and break it down into the trade areas that make a huge difference to low-income countries and try and get breakthroughs there. Cotton is a good example, maybe oil seeds. And on the grains, I'd be much less worried about it because don't forget, put it differently. As we move into a developing, an income growth future, developing countries, and particularly African countries, are going to become increasingly large importers of basic food staples. So that for the prices of those to be kept down is basically a plus. And I'd say that's particularly true in West Africa. So I would take a commodity by commodity approach on it and try and get, and then, what the U.S. has to do then is to find, if they're going to screw the cotton farmers but leave the wheat farmers alone, then they got to find some other way to help out the cotton farmers, and that's not easy to do. But no, I agree that there is a problem there.
Charles Uphouse with Bread for the World, formerly USAID. Just a comment to get at your point about the skewed sectoral distribution of foreign aid these days, with so much of it going to health and so little to agriculture, and also to get at the question about the role of foreign governments. If you look at the example of the MCC, where the content of their compacts is determined by the recipient country, you find these countries asking for a lot more in the form of agriculture and rural infrastructure.
Yes.
So one way of getting around this dilemma that we're in would be to say, hey, let's put more of the decision making to the countries, African countries, and they will ask for more agriculture. Yeah. And it's not something necessarily that we have to drive, I don't think, from this end, because they seem to be recognizing that this is where the emphasis needs to be placed.
Right. I think that I've understated I think I'm taking a little archaic view of where the developing countries are. That they've come around to seeing the importance of agriculture significantly, and so we can shift more of the burden in that direction. Just a comment on MCC. We have this weird situation that MCC, we have two foreign aid agencies. Well, we have about 50, but we have two big ones. And MCC does two things right. That it is oriented towards the developing countries, what they want to do, and it gives them a good deal of freedom on all of that. And I think that's good. And it basically doesn't do technical assistance. But the low-income countries are very short of technically confident people. Now, partly because we haven't done much training of people from those countries. And if you believe in revealed preference, then we prefer to have them uneducated so we can provide the technical assistance forever. But hopefully that's revealed preference isn't the real explanation of this. So you need technical assistance. And so you got one agency that gives technical assistance and has a half-assed approach to life, and then you have another agency that has the right approach to life but doesn't do any technical assistance.